started, which is saying that mitigation's global, mostly, pretty well has to be. Adaptation is going to largely be local. And that gives it certain unique abilities, or gives us abilities to deal with it. It's clear that adaptation is essential no matter who you believe in terms of the degree to which climate change will occur. It doesn't matter if it's big or small, it's still going to be necessary because there will be enough risk created to the current enterprises that you will have to begin to build it in, even if it's small. It's normal business practice to understand the changes that affect you and making adaptation strategies within companies, within parks, within small jurisdictions, as well as others. The work has already been done in many countries to identify the key areas of risk, not as well as many people might want. The initial identification was done as much as 10, 15 years ago. So most countries now understand the areas that are likely to be flooded, at a greater risk of storm, the areas of which industries are likely to be badly affected, the ones that are most vulnerable. I do a lot of work with small island developing states and with coastal zones, and they consider themselves probably rightly the most vulnerable and certainly the most likely to be immediately affected. There are certain strategies that are fairly obvious that are now being taken by many. Obviously, you need an inventory of what is most at risk. You know, how many of your highways go right along the shore? How many of your highways, in fact, are built in floodplains and in flood areas likely to be flooded? How much of your agriculture is at the edge of its ecological capacity, so that if you have changes, you can't really, on the small island, move it much unless you move it up a slope, and if it's not a tall island, you're not going to be able to move it up slope. We have models that will give us a pretty good idea of which areas are likely to be most vulnerable under different scenarios. We can map ecological changes. We can map a whole range of assumptions of ecological changes that show us under almost the majority of probable scenarios where the area suitable for producing a particular crop will end up. In Canada, most of our wheat producing climate ends up on rock. Whereas in Eastern and Western Europe, they're delighted because most of the stuff moves from rock. The good climates for crops move north onto a nice alluvial, on nicer alluvial soils. So certainly in terms of North Europe, we did some work with EASA years ago, and we were able to map the areas there that were going to be, under the vast majority of scenarios, the most critical. And in fact, one of adaptation strategies been done in Europe is to actually preserve some of those areas for future crop production. It's not very well done, but they're starting to do that. They don't want to allow areas to be ruined for possible future development, for agriculture, for forestry. Other very simple things, like you're planting trees that take 50 years to grow. Don't plant them at the southern extreme of their range. Why not pick one that isn't at the southern extreme of its range, and who may be viable now, but certainly in future is more robust and more resilient to a whole range of climate changes. Most actions to deal with adaptation will be local, and that makes them a lot easier to sell to politicians than actions for large-scale reductions in emissions, because the beneficiaries of the benefits are the same ones who have to make the investment. And that is probably going to make it easier to get people to invest in their own futures. It's not as obvious when you're saving energy here and another part of the world is the principal beneficiary. And that has been a very hard job for the international agencies to sell. You're not going to tell Mr. Trump he's got to mail money to Kiribati to keep it above water. However, the day he begins to realize that his Mar-a-Lago property is also going to be underwater, we could well have some effect in altering his perception. So because most of the activities that you would want to do to reduce your exposure to climate change, whether it's huge or whether it's only small, are the same ones that a normal, sane investment manager, business manager would want you to do to make sure that you protect your own investments in your own properties. It's going to be relatively easy to build it in. And I know that JC is going to get more into this in terms of individual firms. But when I go and talk to people in small island developing states, and they talk about, well, how can we take actions that are good now, that create good now, but also create a range of good in the future and one that is not going to be vulnerable? It's a much easier sell than say, oh, do it differently because in the future you'll need it. Just give you one simple example from the Maldives. Maldives learned the hard way when a tsunami went through of what a real big storm surge can do to those islands. So what did they do? They built mosques. Sounds reasonable? Well, let me explain. Every small island, and they're tiny, they're not much bigger than a football field, most of them have villages on them. Most of them would be swept away by a large storm surge. And it's reasonably probable under most scenarios that the storm surges will be larger in future. So the government decided to build a new mosque on every island, a 2-story cement mosque. And the deal was, it's not just for the Muslims, and there are people who aren't Muslims there. The day that there is a storm surge, we now have a safe place for everyone. So if the storm surge goes by, there's enough room in the 2nd story for everybody on those islands. Most of them only have 200-300 people. They even let tourists in, but only during storm surges. So the moral of this is to look for solutions that bring benefits now. Getting a new mosque in your island was immensely popular, as well as a very wise strategy for reducing vulnerability, for taking mitigation actions. And I'm going to stop there now and let JC go on to how the financial industry and others is on our side.